And George III didn't do the kind of things that 18th century tyrants do. He didn't close down any newspapers, arrest any editors. He did not behave like a tyrant in any way.
Hello and welcome to Offscript. My name is Steven Edginton. George III is often portrayed as the Mad King, the king who lost America, an evil tyrant who ruled over his subjects with an iron grip. However, one historian disagrees. Andrew Roberts' new book attempts to paint a different picture of the longest-serving King of England. We're also going to be talking about historical revisionism and whether we're living in a new cultural revolution. Why did you choose George III?
I chose him because, as my subtitle of this book points out, he is Britain's most misunderstood monarch. He's down there with sort of Richard II and King John in terms of his historical reputation, and he shouldn't be. He should be right towards the top. He was actually a serious and substantial figure who was nothing like the king that he's been made out to be by radical Whig politicians and liberal historians.
Where does this misunderstanding come from?
Well, literally that, the fact that the history was written very largely in the 19th century by the Whigs and their historians, their sort of pet in-house historians. It wasn't really until much later on in the 20th century that people were able to have another look at him. And since 2015, the Queen has allowed some 100,000 pages of his correspondence and papers to be available, and they're brilliantly curated by the Georgian Papers programme at King's College London, and they show a completely different king from the one that has hitherto been denigrated.
Can you talk about the modern perceptions of George III? You mentioned Hamilton in your book. How is he seen today?
Yes, I think people know three things about him. The first, that he had porphyria, this illness, which is the thing that drove him mad. The second thing is that he was his obstinacy essentially led to Britain losing the American colonies, and also that he was, as Hamilton the musical you mentioned pointed out, but also the Declaration of Independence stated, a tyrant. And I have to tell you that none of those three things are true. He didn't have porphyria. It certainly wasn't his fault that we lost the American War of Independence. His generals and his admirals and the cabinet ministers and the government bear far greater responsibility for the defeats there, even assuming that that was a winnable war in the first place. And he certainly was not a tyrant. Of the 28 charges levelled against him in the Declaration of Independence, only 2 of them are true.
And where does this idea that he's a tyrant come from? You talk about the Declaration of Independence. Is it something, obviously, it's something to do with the American story, isn't it?
It's in there. There's a phrase about his tyranny and how he was a prince unfit to rule a free people, and so on. And he has this, I mean, the first 2 paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence are, of course, absolutely sublime. They use Shakespearean language. They raise up the concept of the political human being. It's a wonderful first 2 paragraphs. But then when Thomas Jefferson got into the nitty-gritty and tried to prove that George was a tyrant, in fact, he only really proved that he was exactly the same as any other of the last 9 sovereigns who ruled over American colonies.
Is the American independence story then basically based on a myth?
Not really, no, because of course the 2 charges that were true in the Declaration, the one that the British had the right to tax the colonists and that Parliament had the right to legislate for the colonists, do in and of themselves, justify the American Revolution. But I'm arguing that this was for self-government and for autonomy and independence, not to escape some kind of oppressive regime, because it simply was America in the 1760s and 1770s was one of the freest societies in the world. And George III didn't do the kind of things that 18th century tyrants do, like impose large troops in towns, except for in Boston from 1768. He didn't do that. He didn't close down any newspapers, arrest any editors, stop the Stamp Act Congress or the First Continental Congress from taking place, which he could have done. You know, he did not behave like a tyrant in any way.
You've written your book to try and portray George III in a different light to what people would normally assume or believe. Where did this come from? Have you had access to new documents? Have you used different sources? Why have you suddenly come up with this new idea of George III?
The major source has been the Georgian Papers programme, which really is an extraordinary sort of avalanche of new material that the Royal Archives have put out, and it really does show a very different kind of king. For example, in the papers there's an essay that he wrote in the 1750s when he was Prince of Wales, which held up the concept of slavery to execration, was his word. He believed it was ludicrous and absurd, any arguments trying to defend slavery. And that was why he never bought or sold a slave in his life, never owned a slave, never invested in any of the Royal African societies or companies or any of those bodies that did such things. It was why he signed the legislation that abolished the slave trade. And yet he's accused of being a tyrant in a declaration written by people, 41 of the 56 signatories of whom were indeed slave owners.
And you also mentioned that they originally accused him for slavery, right? That was one of their original accusations.
Yes, exactly. Well, the slave trade. And so the hypocrisy of that is obvious, I think, to all. Having said that, of course, it's a propaganda document. They're fighting a war. You know, you don't praise your enemy during a war. So it's perfectly understandable why the founding fathers should have sought to portray George III in the way that they did. It's just that now, 200 years later, we can get beyond that and see, in fact, that this was a highly cultured monarch. He was a Renaissance prince in many ways, and he was an absolute true believer in the British Constitution and the Enlightenment.
And of course, it's not just the American scholars and people fighting for independence who criticised George III. As you mentioned earlier on in the interview, he's also seen in Britain as the man who lost the American War of Independence, the man who lost America. How much truth is there in that? Can he be blamed whatsoever for losing that war?
Not really. I mean, he didn't do anything to try and hold it back, of course. He was a constitutional monarch. There's only one point in his whole career and his whole reign that he appointed a prime minister who didn't have the support of the House of Commons. And on that occasion, it was because the radical Whigs were trying to nationalize the East India Company and draw all the power of East India into their own hands. And he stopped that. And in the subsequent general election, William Pitt the Younger won against the radical Whigs. So it was sort of justified ex post facto, as it were. So yes, you have this man who did definitely go along with Lord North and the cabinet and the government and the majority in the House of Commons and House of Lords that wanted to go to war rather than allow America to secede. It's not until 1905 that you have a moment in history where a colony does secede with Norway and Sweden. I mean, up until that point, secession meant warfare, you know, and I don't think that therefore George III can be particularly personally blamed for that.
Can you give people some kind of context of the time in terms of how much power George III did have as monarch? You mentioned that he appointed prime minister against the majority of the House of Commons once. What kind of powers did he have, and what powers could he have used but didn't use?
Well, he could have vetoed legislation in the House of Commons. He could have just refused to sign an act of parliament, which he never did. As I say, he tended to appoint prime ministers who could command majorities. He had the powers of peace and war, and actually he didn't exercise those ever against the government's will. He actually had, although he had a great deal of power, needless to say, and much more than even Queen Victoria, let alone our present Queen. He used these powers on the whole wisely, and he had less power the Harvard Law Journal has pointed out last April, than the present American president has.
Wow. It's also interesting that, George III himself is an interesting character, but the time that he was alive and the wars and the transformation of Britain and British society is also fascinating. What kind of role did he play within the major events during his lifetime? For example, the Napoleonic Wars. He was king.
He was impressive in the Napoleonic Wars in that he constantly opposed making peace with regicide France. What finally defeated Napoleonic France was the way in which the coalition stayed together, very often with British money. When the Austrians were at war with France for 108 weeks, the Prussians for 53 weeks, the Russians for 55 weeks. I'm so sorry, months in each case. It was the British who were in the war for 242 months that really kept that coalition going. And of course, ultimately, the Russian campaign of 1812 was the thing that broke Napoleon's military might, but his economic power was already in decline because of the British blockade and this refusal to make peace, which was very much something the king supported.
And during times of peace and times of war, especially in times of hardship, even today, people look up to their monarch and draw inspiration, hope. We've got a collective sense of identity in Britain. There's this sort of stoic institution that will always be there no matter what. How did his subjects view himself? Was he a popular king at the time?
He wasn't popular right at the beginning. He installed a prime minister, his former tutor, the Earl of Bute, to be prime minister, who was Scottish. And this was less than 20 years after the Jacobite rebellion, which had marched down as far as Derby. And so that was tremendously unpopular. It was also totally unfairly assumed that his mother was sleeping with the Earl of Bute, the prime minister, and that undermined him a great deal as well, even though it was completely untrue. And so he did. There were occasions, especially during the Wilkesite riots in the late 1760s, when he had mud thrown at his coach and stones thrown at it as he was going to open Parliament. However, later on in his life, and especially as he became older and older, and finally the oldest and longest reigning king in British history, he became tremendously popular. And the Jubilee of 1809 that was celebrated throughout the country was a real national celebration.
Why was that? Why did he become so popular?
Well, because he was so steady. He was frugal in his manners. He was prudent financially, unlike his son George IV. He was a patriotic monarch. The first thing he said when he opened Parliament was, on the first occasion, was born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain. So although his predecessors had been German, indeed some hadn't even spoken English, he spoke English and without a German accent, and that made him popular. And he was somebody who had this tremendous sense of what the people were interested in. They nicknamed him Farmer George because he was interested in agriculture. He wrote articles on manure and crop rotation and things like that. And at that stage, 80% of the country drew their living from agriculture in some way or another. Interestingly, he didn't have much to do with the Industrial Revolution, which started in the 1780s. He never went north of Worcester or west of Plymouth, which is quite extraordinary considering that he was king of Scotland and Ireland and elector of Hanover, and obviously had his American colonies, and he never really moved outside the home counties.
What was the reason for that? Was he not intellectually curious about his own subjects?
Well, he was tremendously intellectually curious, but he was intellectually curious rather than personally curious. He had a collection of 40,000 topographical maps in his collection. His library forms the nucleus of the British Library today, with his 80,000 books that he collected, lots of them on America, by the way. And so he had this intellectual interest. It extended to astronomy. He built the world's largest telescope, and the planet Uranus was originally named after him. So he had this interest in things beyond the home counties, but he didn't feel the need to go there.
In terms of his contemporary monarchs in Europe, how does he compare? For example, we talk about the word tyrant. You argue that he wasn't a tyrant, but how does he compare to his contemporaries?
Very, very well indeed. He certainly was not a tyrant. When one looks at Catherine the Great killing 50,000 Russians in the Pugachev uprising, or the way that the French behaved in Corsica, the way that Spanish shot the people responsible for the uprising in New Orleans, there was a viciousness to the European autocracies that is completely missing in George III, who had enormous trouble even making sure that John Wilkes was arrested and imprisoned. It was a sort of classic example of the common law defeating any kind of hard authoritarianism. One really does look in vain in those documents that the Queen has made available since 2015 to find any desire to be tyrannical at all. And so I do, as I say, think he's the most tremendously misunderstood monarch in British history.
Do you think the fact that he was a sort of benign king in that sense enabled Britain to become one of the most powerful countries in the world during his reign?
Well, it's extraordinary that although, of course, we lost the American colonies at exactly the same time, and in a sense, because of that, because of all the loyalists, about a third of Americans stayed loyal to him and were forced to leave or at least tens of thousands of them were forced to leave the country. They went off to Canada and India and places in Africa and so on, and started the wider British Empire, the next British Empire, which by the time George III died had become the largest the world had ever seen. So in that sense, the whole story has a happy ending.
There's an idea that George is sort of played by politicians at the time. Is there any truth in the fact that perhaps he was manipulated, or you talk about him not being a tyrant, but some people would argue that prime ministers were able to sort of walk all over him?
No, that wasn't the case. You're right that that's an accusation that's been made, especially with regard to William Pitt the Younger. I think his major problem really was that there were very few good prime ministers. Of all his prime ministers, over a dozen of them, only William Pitt the Elder and William Pitt the Younger were great men. William Pitt the Younger, unfortunately, the Elder, by the time he was appointed, had such appalling gout that it had driven him mad, essentially, and sent him into deep depression. But his relationship with William Pitt the Younger was superb. He was prime minister for 17 years of George's reign. They didn't personally become friends or anything. They never had dinner together, for example, but they respected and admired one another, and they saw eye to eye on politics. And so, or at least not everything in politics, but most of it. And so, really, I think George's problem was that he wanted to take people completely regardless of party or ideology, whoever was the best people, the most intelligent and impressive, persuasive politicians of the day, and appoint them to the cabinet. And of course, the party system didn't work like that in the House of Commons, and so he was constantly up against the Whig establishment. They'd been in power for 80 years, these Whig oligarchs, and they didn't like the idea of the king turning to Tories and turning to independents for ministers.
The other thing people remember about George III is, of course, his madness. Can you talk about, in 21st century terms, what he may have suffered with, and how that impacted his reign?
Yes, for many years, since the late 1960s, there's been a complete misunderstanding about his illness, which has been diagnosed as porphyria. And that's what Alan Bennett's um, play and the film of the play and so on have all assumed was true, but it wasn't. Modern analysis now completely undermines the porphyria theory, which I'm afraid is largely to do with the color of feces and urine that the king produced, which in porphyria makes the feces and urine a sort of bluish purple color, hence the name porphyria. But actually that happened on very few occasions, and it was usually after the king had taken gentium or beetroot or aloes, which can explain the coloration. But no modern doctor thinks that it's still true. It was bipolar disorder, a manic depression that he suffered from. And boy, did he suffer. It was appalling. You know, the basics of 18th century, what they called mad doctors, is sort of shocking. He spent an awful lot of time in straitjackets, being held down on his bed or on a chair for hours and hours, sometimes days. He was given cupping, in which a heated glass is placed on his arms or his legs to bring up boils on his body. These things did no good whatsoever. He was bled on several occasions as well, and he was incredibly courageous through all of this. He unfortunately, he was sane enough in intervals to recognize that what was going on. So he was the sort of horrified spectator at his own mental collapse.
It must have been extraordinary to put the king in a straitjacket and to hold him down. What was that process like? Was that just seen as a very normal scientific practice from the doctors at the time?
It was done by the doctor's attendants, who were big, sort of burly men who were physically capable of restraining him. Yes, it happened an awful lot. I mean, in each of the 4 of the last of his bouts of illness. I'm the first historian, I think, to claim that in 1765 he had a prodrome attack, which is a sort of weaker version of what was to come later. And he wasn't, so far as we know, he wasn't put in a straitjacket on that occasion. But he spent the last 10 years of his life mad and also blind and deaf and senile. So it actually was a tremendously it's a story of great pathos, the final chapter of my book, I think.
Well, as an historian, it must be interesting to write about such a long period of time in which your subject is going through such difficult mental health problems. How did you find that a struggle?
Not really, no. I mean, obviously you don't write about George III unless you know a little about how you're going to deal with this. I was helped enormously by Sir Simon Wesley, the professor who is also the president of the Royal College of Medicine, and he's the only person also to have been president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists as well. So he sort of helped me through the more technical side of manic depression and bipolar disorder and why this was what the king actually had. But I also was helped by other people who were experts in porphyria as well, pointing out that it wasn't porphyria that he suffered from.
Final questions on George III, and just getting back to this issue of America. Do you think that at the time Britain was more free and had more liberty than those American colonies when they declared their independence?
No, not really. I think that, of course, they had representation. Britons were represented in Parliament, but the Americans also had their own provincial assemblies, which created laws, and which for most of the time the royal governors got on well with. One has to remember that there were colonies for 150 years before the Revolution in America, and the first time, in fact, in history that America was an independent country longer than it was a colony was in 1946. And this is a very pro-American book, essentially, because what it proves is that there is such a thing as American exceptionalism. There are any number of people in history, the Israelites against the Egyptians, the Dutch against the Austrians, and Spanish, the Italians against the Austrians, the Greeks against the Turks, just any number throughout history of peoples who struggle against an oppressive regime for their independence and sovereignty. But only with America do you have people who revolt and stage a full-scale revolution for their independence and sovereignty against the country that's not oppressing.
Let's move on to wider discussions of historical revisionism. We chatted before on a different podcast about Winston Churchill, accusations against him of being a racist, a tyrant and a colonializer and all those things. Do you think that we're going through a kind of cultural evolution akin to what Mao instigated in China back in the 1960s?
Well, I don't think anyone's going to die in the way that happened during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. I'm hoping that they're not going to be dragging out professors and shooting them, at least. But yes, you're right. Of course, there's a culture war going on, and it's a great sadness, really. This was not brought on by conservative-minded people. This was entirely brought on by people who want to try to judge the past entirely by the mores of the present in a way that just simply makes no sense, really, philosophically or intellectually. But nonetheless, they are insisting on doing this. And by the way, I think that and Winston Churchill obviously is on the front line of this culture war. But I think that there might be a bit of a counter-revolution going on. It strikes me that whenever local people are asked whether or not they want the statues of Francis Drake or Robert Baden-Powell or Buller, for example, to be the General Buller in Exeter, to be pulled down, they don't. So what I'd like to see is much more referenda, local people being asked what they think about the destruction of statues of their local heroes, and see what happens, because I'm pretty much convinced now that this is the voice of a very small minority of ultra woke political warriors who do not represent the view of the British people whatsoever.
There is an argument from those who may write in The Guardian, for example, who say that these culture wars are irrelevant, that it's completely understandable that oppressed minorities historically should want to remove symbols of that oppression, and they would talk about people who owned slaves or part of the slave trade. Edward Colston, famously in Bristol, his statue was torn down by protesters. And they say, look, this isn't historical revisionism. This is simply being kind to people whose past in Britain and in our colonies around the empire has been a dark one. And it's quite right that people should learn about that dark history, and we shouldn't be lauding these evil tyrants with statues on our streets.
Are you telling me that Mr. Colston was an evil tyrant? Yes, he made money from the slave trade. What did he spend it on? Why did they put that statue up to him? Not because he was a slave trader, but because he spent the money that he earned from this foul and evil practice on the people of Bristol, on the educational facilities in Bristol. That's the thing that's being commemorated by the statue. Nothing to do with slavery at all. Same with Guy at Guy's Hospital. Same with Hans Sloane at the British Library. It's the very fact that we who believe in redemption, should really believe in redemption at least, were and are impressed by the redemptive actions of those people in spending their great ill-gotten gains on good and philanthropic things. Frankly, I think that's a part of the Christian tradition in this country.
There is an argument on the other side of that says actually it's even more serious than people trying to tear down statues. They would argue that, look, what you saw in Mao's China, and as you say, that involved tens of thousands of people being killed and many others being brutally tortured and sent to camps and the most brutal conditions possible. But there are some who say that this isn't just about tearing down statues. It's about sort of trying to kind of brainwash children. It's about trying to rewrite our entire history to a sort of year zero, and it's about trying to restructure our society. Do you think it's more serious than it looks on the outside of just simple protesters trying to remove statues? There's actually something even more serious going on here.
Yes, I very much think that. I mean, these culture wars are not just about statues. Of course, they're not. They're about national educational curricula. They're about what our children are being taught in schools about their great grandparents and what they did, and it's an attempt to make us feel ashamed of British past, which is I think completely outrageous, frankly, because there's so much more. Of course, there are some things that one should be ashamed of, but they were taught when I was a child. They've constantly been taught. The idea that we've had some kind of a whitewashed historical curriculum up until then now is completely ridiculous. The fact is that things need to be seen in their proper historical context, and what is being done at the moment, and as you say, this is much more than just statues. Is very worrying, because ultimately I think that people who are no longer proud of their past become untethered, and I don't want that happening in this country, because I think there's an awful lot to be proud of in the British past, indeed a great deal more to be proud of than to be ashamed of.
Now, you are an historian. You've been writing about history for, if I may say, a relatively long time. You enjoy.
Thank you very much.
You're a very enthusiastic historian. You can tell that you enjoy your subjects and that you're very impassioned, obviously, about history. In a sort of wider philosophical sense, why do you think it's important that we learn about history?
Golly, I think Churchill said, didn't he, that the secrets of all statecraft can be found in the study of history. And by statecraft, he didn't just mean the politics. He meant the culture of politics as well, the politics of culture, everything. Unless you look in the past and see where we came from and the things to avoid and the lessons to be learned, I think, as I say, we'd just be a completely untethered society. But that doesn't mean that we should just assume that everything we're told about history is correct. It's vital to double check everything, to go back to original sources when you can, to find trustworthy historians who are going to present evidence-based history, and not go down this route of putting the ideology first and then trying to get the facts to fit into a previously conceived ideology.
I'm curious to know what you've seen throughout your career as an historian. Do you think that this is a recent phenomenon of people trying to rewrite history, trying to make us ashamed of our past? Obviously we've seen in the news recently, the last few years, statues being pulled down. That's very kind of easy for everyone to see. But has this been going on for a long time?
Well, I mean, you get it in revolutions. Obviously, they pulled down a few statues of Lenin in the when the Cold War ended and the Berlin Wall came down. It's a well-known phenomenon in violent revolutions and peaceful ones too. So in a sense, all history is a revision of previous history. It's not in the slightest bit surprising. I mean, I'm doing that with my George III book. I'm attempting to revise the historical accepted view of one of the kings of England. So the whole process of history is constantly revising what's been said about the past in the past. But what I think today we've got, though, is a vicious new strain of non-evidence-based history, of people who because they're supporters of Black Lives Matter, for example, want to present Winston Churchill in a way that makes very little sense. in terms of the actual evidence that they provide, or at least they don't see it in the overall context of a much wider story, a much longer life, a much broader career, for example. And so I think we have got to a dangerous moment here where, as I say, only a small minority, but a very, very vocal minority, because the media love these stories about heroes being dragged through the dust, and which overall I think is not going to be a positive aspect of our national life.
It may be a small minority, but they've certainly got a loud voice. And I think there was a poll that said, a sort of sizable chunk of young people didn't know that Winston Churchill was a real person. And
20%, yes, exactly, thought that he was a fictional character, and more of them believed that Sherlock Holmes and Eleanor Rigby were real people.
So this idea of, are these activists having an impact? Are we teaching history well in schools, for example? As I've been growing up and looking at, with social media and things like that, people my age, kind of early 20s, are sharing things all the time about how awful Winston Churchill is, and they're kind of viewing these previous British heroes as villains. So I think there is, I think it's having a big impact.
Yeah, you're right. Of course it is. We wouldn't be talking about it now if it wasn't. It doesn't mean that it can't be, as people of your age grow older and are more interested in the past, perhaps, that they can't learn the truth. They can't read books about Churchill and work out the true basis of it. They might even actually watch that show that you and I did about Winston Churchill and race that's presumably on YouTube, and which I don't suppose need to revise altogether nowadays.
Presumably you speak to young people in schools and not just in schools, but at different events in museums and things like that. Do you think that we are teaching history properly in the curriculum? And what do you think the best way is to enthuse young people about history?
I don't think it's that difficult to enthuse people about history. The stories are so extraordinary. They genuinely are stranger than fiction, many of them. I think that there's a thirst out there for history, but I just hope it isn't going to be a history that is based on the ideology of the teachers, rather than something that can be appreciated by all.
And if you had any advice to students, for example, when I was at school, I was growing up with very ideological teachers, particularly, history teachers, I think, were probably the most left-wing kind of group of teachers in my school, for example. Maybe it's just one example, but, and when I left school, I started reading other books. I started reading your books and other historians' books, and it kind of gave me a different perspective on history than the one that I was given in my classes. If you had any advice to students today, what would it be? Would you say to them, look, we'd read more widely and try and be a bit more critical about the things that you're being taught?
Of course, absolutely, yes. Study history, as Churchill said. It's and not just history, biography, of course, is tremendously important as well. The two overlap so much. Yes. Maybe go beyond the academy, read the books of freelance historians, people who aren't tethered to a particular institution. That might also give you a slightly wider perspective. But overall, just constantly looking again at the same story from different angles has always got to be a good thing.
Now, this book, George III, is one of many that you've written, and many a biography you've written. We talked previously about Churchill, Napoleon, and you've written, I think it's about Salisbury. Was that your first one? Back in the 90s?
Not my first one, but that was one of them in the late 1990s, yeah.
Yeah, and you've been continued to be published, despite the fact I'd say that, you've got quite conservative opinions. I think you'd argue that you'd probably agree with that on history. How have you remained uncancelled?
Oh well, I don't know. I might be tomorrow. It hangs over absolutely everybody. I might have said something in this in this interview that's going to wind up getting me cancelled. I'm not as scared of it as some of my friends and colleagues. Partly because I have given up bothering to try to apologise, and I think that if you stand by what you say, assuming what you say is properly represented and that you believe it, then there's not that much that the Twitter sphere can do. Obviously, you can be horribly damaged professionally if you say something ludicrous or absurd, but I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that I don't say it. I don't believe things that are ludicrous and absurd, so I can't see why I should say them.
What have been the implications of previous attempts in societies, previous revolutions, in order to who have attempted to destroy their idols, to destroy their historical monuments? What's been the impact of that within society? For example, the French Revolution or the Cultural Revolution. Can you talk about some of the implications of attempting to do that within a society?
I think that historically, when you look at the French Revolution or the Cultural Revolution in China, this concept of trying to go back to a mythical year zero, you see it in Fahrenheit 451, the Ray Bradbury novel. There's a lot that you lose, a lot of tradition, a lot of historical memory, a lot of sense of custom, and the way that people genuinely live their lives. All of that is done away with in some puritanical utopian attempt to create the perfect society, which, as we know from the fact that they have to be created from human beings, cannot exist. So it's totally tragic when you see these vicious, totalitarian, usually, attempts to erase history. I'm not saying that that's really what the woke culture is trying to do now. I don't believe that's the case in England. They're attempting to alter the way we look at history, but they're not attempting to rub it out altogether. But I would much prefer than a statue being pulled down, for example, if it were put in context, if there were a board beside it explaining why it was put up and the negative sides, if necessary, of the person's life and so on. So much better that. And also so much better to put up more statues. There should be many more statues in London and England to women and to people of colour and to people who are disabled and so on, glorifying their lives. You don't have to drag down statues. It's much better. They're beautiful things. They're marvellous public furniture. So let's put up more statues. I'm always delighted to see when that's being done.
And finally, you've talked a lot in this interview about evidence-based history, about remaining objective, about approaching a subject with a sort of blank slate and letting the evidence drive your conclusions. What do you say to those who disagree with you, who might accuse you of being a sort of activist historian about, you've got very strong opinions, and they might argue that you have those opinions and you sort of try and make the facts fit your own viewpoint?
I've never once done that. Literally, when I sit down and write a book, which I do with all of the evidence that I've managed to produce, if something completely goes against something that I believe, I still stick it down. I've done that with all of my books. I've never allowed my political views to colour my book. That would be a crime against objectivity. So yes, I'm sure that I have been criticised for doing that. But the thing is, if you have a pure and clean conscience like mine, Stephen, you don't let it keep you awake at night.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us. That was brilliant.
Thank you.